The digital transition. The Digital Transition, a podcast series created to assist those tasked with implementing digital strategies, where we will share our knowledge and experiences to support you in your transition. Welcome to The Digital Transition. I'm your host, Nathan Hildebrandt, and today I'm fortunate enough to have Paul Shillcock all the way from the UK with me. Now, Paul runs his own advisory and education business called Operam. Now, for over 10 years, he's played a prominent role in the development of national and international standards for the management of information. This is namely in the forms of UK 1192 series and the ISO 19650 series. So who better to explain the benefits of adopting ISO 19650 series within your organisation and on all of your projects? But before I talk to Paul, I need to talk to you about our exclusive podcast sponsor, NBS. So NBS, through their key product, NBS Chorus, is revolutionising construction specification through cloud-based collaboration. NBS Chorus integrates seamlessly with your BIM in ArchiCAD and Revit. Now, this increases productivity and reduces risk of conflict information in your deliverables. Now, to learn more about NBS, head over to their website, www.thenbs.com.au. Now, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today, Paul.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, you're a pretty special person, and, you know, it's not very often. Well, actually, all of my podcasts, I think everyone's superstars. But firstly, Paul, for those that are not aware of who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a military engineer by background. So back in the day, you had military engineering and civilian engineering, and that was short down to civil. So I was very aligned with being a civil engineer. But so I was in the Royal Engineers for just under 10 years. And, you know, looking back, it's still probably the most collaborative environment I've worked in terms of teams working together to achieve a goal. And it was only when I come out that I discovered things like contracts and profit and poor leadership, you know, that sort of breaks all that down. And it's not really the right environment for teams to work collaboratively. And I guess that's sort of been a big part of the work that I've done over the past sort of 20 years since coming out in terms of trying to establish better, more effective teams. And then from leaving the military, I had a few various roles, all which really sort of were geared towards helping organisations and projects to improve the way in which they procure, produce, manage and use information about the built environment. I guess one of the key roles was in 2007, I joined London Underground. And at that time, there was the Crossrail project, which is at the time one of the largest projects in the Northern Hemisphere, who London Underground were going to be the ultimate owner from. And so Crossrail were asking London Underground quite simple questions around, you know, what information do you need? When do you need it? How would you like us to provide you that information, and so on? And none of which we had that many answers to. So I guess my role there was working on the client side, was to try and put in place a lot of the sort of answers to the questions in terms of the information that was going to be needed, not just for the delivery of Crossrail and the other major projects, but in the operational life, you know, given that some of London Underground's assets were already 150 years old. And it was around that time that the UK government was starting to think seriously about the construction industry and how to deliver more for less. And a big part of that was the government construction strategy, which was published in 2011. So I was fortunate to be part of a team who assisted in sort of a lot of the pre-work or the build-up to that strategy. And then after that was published, we had obviously the BIM level 2 strategic objective, which was all great, but obviously wasn't very defined at that point. So we then set about developing what became the UK 1192 series, and I was asked to co-author part 2, which looked at the delivery phase and set out really the strategic framework for BIM Level 2 in the UK. So with all that in mind, I started to sort of get really into the process side and the people side. And so in 2012, I set up my own company, Operam, and really to sort of help to provide, both advisory and educational services to organisations wanting to align with those industry standards, namely the UK 1192 series. And then probably a bit sooner than we expected, in 2014, I was then asked to elevate the UK 1192 series to ISO and be part of the team to develop ISO 19650. So specifically, I'm the author of ISO 19650 Part 2 and the co-author of the transition guidance from 1192 to 19650. So, but a lot of that in terms of the government support and standards development is a bit of a hobby. I'm still very much a practitioner, working on at the moment. We're working on a Dublin Metrolink over in Ireland, which is Ireland's largest infrastructure project, and hopefully will become a key exemplar of how to implement at the ISO 19650 series. And aside from that, I still sort of continue to support government. So played a small part in ABAB, the Australian BIM Advisory Board, over the years. I'm currently working for the Centre for Digital Built Britain in advising governments, particularly the US. So we've been working closely with our counterparts in the US probably now 18 months. And you may have seen things like the Memorandum of Understanding with the UK. So yeah, still very much a practitioner.
Now I can understand how you've been an author of those standards. So military training and civil engineering, two very rigid systems and process-based roles.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think I learnt on the drawing board, so I was there for the transition from the drawing board to the computer, and so my main focus, if you're talking about the people, process, and technologies, is very much the people side of things, and now that we're sort of again a major transition, a lot of the time we all know that people are the key to this, and how can we actually start to build effective teams, which for me ultimately is what the process is there to support. It just happens to be enabled by technology, and I think we've got as Operam, we've got a bit of a unique position where we don't actually do technology, which is a bit unusual for a company that specialises in the management of information. But I think for all the advancements and innovations and tools, all we've really done is being able to produce poor quality information faster than we could with the previous tool. Because we're not really given the attention or investing in the individuals in terms of the skills, and not only the technical skills, but also the soft skills about communication and leadership and collaboration. So yeah, that's something I've definitely brought from, I think, from the military, or at least I tried to.
Now, in your introduction about yourself, you touched on Operam and how your role or the services that Operam provide are centred around consultancy and training. Do you want to delve into a little bit more detail so the guests understand the services that Operam actually provides, so if they're interested in reaching out to you?
Yeah, I mean, when we set up, I guess it was predominantly focused on the advisory side of things. So what we wanted to do was to help organisations and major projects to align their business processes with the latest industry standards and best practice. At that time, it was around the UK 1192, more so now, ISO 19650. But a big part of that, it was clear that, it was around education and quite often re-education of the people within the organisations or the projects. So there's two sides to the business in terms of the advisory and education, and that's where Operam Academy fits in. So the idea there is around helping organisations to build capability and capacity that they need to manage information effectively. Although we're based in the UK, the vast majority of our customers are outside of the UK. And so in terms of Australia, we work with McDonald's to help develop Transport for New South Wales BIM roadmap. And then we were directly appointed to help establish what is now the digital engineering framework. And we've also worked with Operam quite a lot over the years. We've helped shape their sort of strategy and played a small part in them getting certified as well, or being one of the first engineering consultancies to be certified against the ISO 19650 series. And just before the pandemic, we were working closely with Lendlease as well over in Australia. And on the educational point of view, I say Oregon have been a big client of ours over the last couple of years, and we've recently just done one of our boot camps with the Oregon team as well, which involved some early mornings on my part, which is all good. But we've also got the likes of GHD, 12D, we've got, and across the New Zealand, Kiwi Rail are starting to ramp up as well in terms of their use of Operam Academy. So we've got quite a good, really proud of our sort of customer base globally. We've now sold into over 40 countries, particularly with Operam Academy. So it's all going pretty well at the moment. Now,
moving on to the reason why I wanted to talk to you specifically today, the knowledge level of my listeners on the history of ISO 19650 would vary from no experience whatsoever to a reasonably good, strong knowledge and understanding of how that's all, how the roadmap essentially of how it all occurred. Would you be able to provide like a short history lesson for our listeners on the history of ISO 19650? So touching on its beginnings as the UK standard, where you started with it, and I guess the key reasons why the standards were created in the first place.
Yeah, I think there is this perception that, the standards have been written by people in a dark room somewhere. And quite often you hear, they've obviously never worked on a project type sort of thing, and it's quite an academic process when actually it's couldn't be further from the truth. I think, going back to what occurred before the standards were developed, globally, but specifically in the UK, there was a lot of research around the sort of the failings of the construction industry. So we had reports like the Latham and the Egan report, and we were very good at looking at what was going wrong in terms of the industry, in terms of its low productivity, and out of all those reports, there was always these key recommendations. And when you look at the root cause of a lot of these issues, poor quality information, poor communication, were all root causes of a lot of the issues. And so that's really the starting point for the standards. And you can still see within the clauses and the requirements within the standards that a link between what's being required within the standard and the recommendations from a lot of this research. And that was so, in terms of the development, again, bringing into strong leadership, Sir John Egan on Heathrow Terminal 5 project, wanted to develop this collaborative approach to the production of information. And so he put a team together, led by Mervyn Richards, to develop a process that would support that. So that was developed and implemented on Heathrow, again, another major infrastructure project. It was then tested through the Avanti Research project on a wide variety of different projects, and all of which was independently verified to demonstrate that actually, if you applied this process, you could reduce the outturn cost of projects on average by 20%. And that's just by removing those wasteful activities in terms of, the overproduction, overprocessing, rework, and so on. And so that then became what we know as BS 1192, and that was published in 2007. So there's already, 10 plus years of research, development and testing that went into publishing BS 1192. Which was entitled, oddly enough, the Collaborative Production of Information. And that was really the standard at that point, given the success of the testing, that all projects would then want to would want to adopt that. But for whatever reason, that wasn't the case. And so in 2010, Paul Morell was appointed as the UK's chief government construction advisor, and then really just frustrated in the sense that we knew how to do it, but just nobody was doing it. So he sort of asked this question: what would happen if we actually mandated the use of this process on all publicly funded projects? And that's really where this whole sort of strategy around BIM Level 2 came. And the term BIM Level 2, for those of you who aren't aware, came from this sort of wedge diagram, which sort of suggested how far we could get within the term of a parliament. But again, as I mentioned before, that was BIM Level 2 wasn't defined. So then we went on to define the information management process, both during the delivery phase, which became was PAS 1192 Part 2, and also the operational phase in terms of Part 3. So what you had in BS 1192 and then PAS 1192 Part 2 and 3 was the end-to-end information management process throughout the asset lifecycle, both for the management of information in terms of Part 2 and 3 and the production of information in BS 1192. And all of that, in terms of that development, was based around large major infrastructure projects, the likes of Crossrail and so on. But they were also applied on schools, hospitals, prisons, and so on. So a wide variety of asset types. And they've developed in a way that we're agnostic to any commercial or procurement route, agnostic to any technology, and also agnostic to any particular type of asset, which when developing the standards is actually quite a bit of a challenge. And I think where a lot of the frustration comes from, because they're not as specific. If you're building a particular type of asset on a particular type of contract, I think people get frustrated because all the answers aren't in the standards. So and then 1192 then increased in terms of Part 4, looking at the information exchange and the structure of data to hand over to the asset owners, which again was another big issue that came from the research. Part 5 around adopting a security-minded approach, again to address the security of information relating to sensitive assets, which again was another biggest challenge that we had in the industry. And then Part 6, probably one of the biggest challenges around health and safety, and how we can incorporate health and safety information within the information model rather than stuck away in an archive box somewhere, so it's readily available. But all of these standards are developed by people and organizations who have got a vast amount of experience of implementing that within industry. And the collaboration behind the working groups that form these standards and the professional bodies that they represent means that there's a wealth of knowledge. The people who write it are probably just to play a small part in the development of the standards. They then go out for public consultation, and so which take days, literally days, to go through hundreds of comments around the standards. And then, so that's in terms of the UK perspective. And I think what happened is that actually there was a lot of international clients who thought, well, if that's if all these are is the way to do it, and we want a bit of that cost reduction as well, and the value that they're going to bring. So you had organisations, Middle East and Australia, like the likes of Transport for New South Wales, mandating these standards, and that really then became this international pull from the international supply chain, saying, well, hang on, that's not really fair if we're working on a project in Australia and we've now got to align with UK standards. So there's this call for the UK 1192 series to be elevated to international level. And again, that process, just parts 1 and 2, which were the first to be published, that took us 4.5 years to develop. And that namely was around, I can remember when we started thinking, this only takes 6 months, just to strip out all the UK bits. And, we had a reasonable draft after 6 months, to be honest, but to get that consensus and international agreement took us 4.5 years. There was, a large amount of involvement from, countries and working groups all around the world in terms of reviewing it and getting that. So, the ISO 19650 series, although their origins are from the UK 1192 series, they're very much an international set of standards. Even Australia had a working group that were actively involved, in terms, I'm saying actively involved, and I'm talking about, getting up in the middle of the night to attend 10 meetings, review meetings, providing comments and so on. So, it is truly an international standard. And I think the other thing with that is that it's enabled multinational teams as well to have a unified approach. I think one of the other challenges that I heard from a lot of customers and colleagues is, where you're working multinational, you've got teams who are all working in different ways, mainly because of the region where that asset is. So if you're working in, Australia, you'd be working to one way. If you're working in the US or if you're working in Europe, what an international standards do and having a unified process, it means that, they can have a unified approach regardless of where that asset is. Yeah, so that's quite a powerful thing for multinational organizations to have, in the sense that, they can, individuals can work and collaboratively in multinational teams on projects anywhere around in the world.
That works really well for multinational companies. We're coming up very soon on the 3-year mark since part 1 and 2 of the ISO 19650 series was released. Because you have an international reach through your training, what's your general perception on how it's been received by the international community as a standard, considering it took 4.5 years to come to some sort of agreement?
I think, let's be honest, I think the adoption hasn't been as quick as, maybe we would all like.
Yep, great.
I still think there's a lot of frustration out there. You've got, companies who, sort of the early adopters who have really gone in. And I think those organizations are the one who see the value within their own organization, regardless of whether clients are asking for it or not. They can see the value in having a managed approach to the way in which they manage and produce information. And then you've still got the companies who are sort of sitting on the fence a little bit to say, well, I'll wait until the client is asking for it. And then you've got obviously people and organizations on the other side who, think this will all just blow over, and we'll just keep on jogging the way that we've always been doing so. But I think in terms of, we are starting to see a shift, in terms of, obviously from a UK perspective, the ISO 19650 series have replaced the UK 1192 series, and that's now become part of what's known as the UK BIM framework. And so that's ISO 19650 plus a series of other standards, which is now being mandated on all publicly funded projects. Again, so this is explicitly now on the UK BIM framework for all publicly funded projects. We've got over in Europe, the EU BIM task group was set up a number of years ago. And so as the European Union have also were actively involved in development. And now that all those standards are being translated into the different languages, and a lot of European countries have now got their national annexes sorted, I think we're going to start to see a big uptake across Europe around the adoption. We've also got things like the Middle East. So the Road Transport Authority in Dubai spring to mind. They were one of the first asset owners, obviously a large asset owner, to not only mandate the use of what was 1192 and now 19650, but they were also, if I'm not wrong, the first asset owning organisation to be certified against parts 2 and 3 in the world. So that again shows you their sort of aspirations and leadership within that region. Obviously, not forgetting Australia. I think New South Wales, and particularly Transport New South Wales, I think we're probably one of the first sort of asset owner organisations to think seriously about information management or digital engineering, as it's known, and shortly followed behind by Victoria with things like the VDAS, the Victorian Digital Asset Strategy, and Queensland as well. I think are probably, in my view, probably the 3 states in Australia who are sort of leading that way. But again, I appreciate the frustration in Australia in terms of maybe the speed of that, and across over in New Zealand, as I say, Kiwi Rail, I think are ones to watch. I think they're really getting their house in order. And yeah, I think Kiwi Rail are going to be leading the way from a New Zealand perspective. And yeah, finally, I guess over in the US, as I mentioned before, through the work that we're doing with the Centre for Digital Britain, the US have finally agreed to develop a national BIM strategy. And so ISO 19650 plays a big part of that. And so the expectation or the anticipation is that 19650 will become a big part of the US construction industry in the next year or two.
Now, there are a lot of buzzwords and marketing that gets thrown around by the supply chain. Now, they're trying to promote themselves to try and win work. And the one that my pet peeves, I guess, is consultants promoting digital twins. And, half of it's wrongly promoted and they're incorrect in their definition. But the whole thing is as well, it's this whole issue now with even consultants going in and talking about going in and, delivering in regards to ISO 19650. And the problem with that, there is a correct order in the approach where people need to go about in their implementation of this standard. When it comes to implementing an ISO 19650 series process, where would you suggest that people start?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think the first thing to think is that, the first thing to point out is that this is a series. So there are currently 5 parts to the series, 4 of which are being published. So parts 1, 2, 3, and 5. Part 4 hopefully will be published next year, and part 6, looking at health and safety, that is in development. So that's probably a year or 2 away. So yeah, and as you say, there is different starting points in terms of out of those 6, where do you actually start? And I think as a good place as any would be part 1 of the series, and the reason for that is that it looks at the concepts and principles for the management production of information throughout the asset life cycle. So it gives you that holistic view and looks at introduces some of the key concepts and principles around the process. So part 1 gives people a good ground and a little bit more understanding about the relationship between the different activities, why they're there, why the processes even exists, the value, the benefit of implementation as well. So part 1 is probably a good place to start as any. I think in terms of the process itself, for clients, owners, asset owning organizations, whatever you want to call them, part 3 is probably the place that they need to be start. I think, I've said it a few times, part 3 is probably the prequel to part 2 in terms of the series. The history behind that is that we just knew more about the delivery phase than the operational phase. So we produced part 2 of 1192 first, and I think that numbering stuck within the ISO. So yeah, if you're a part of a client organization, then you really want to be starting with part 3. And the reason for that is because it talks around a lot of the upstream activities around, defining the requirements for information, both at an organizational perspective in terms of, the information that the organization needs to do whatever it needs to do. So whether that's, running a railway, running a hospital, a commercial building, residential building, whatever it might be. But also the asset information requirements. So the information that they need in order to operate and maintain and decommission the assets within their portfolio. So it's really about sort of, starting to look at the information that they need as an organization, and talks about developing the asset information model based upon the assets that they already have. And that can be, a large portfolio, or it could just be a piece of land. But that really gives the foundation upon which you can then start to go out and procure more data about either existing or new assets that are to be delivered. So part 3 specifically for clients. However, if whether you're a client organization or not, if you're just looking specifically to deliver a project, so you may be an organization that just wants to, give it a go, for one of a better word, then a good starting point would be part 2, which is obviously very project focused. So it talks specifically around the point at which the project is initiated. So yeah, if you're at that point, then part 2 would be your starting point. And then that'll then take you through the process in terms of preparing to go out to tender, to procure that information through the delivery phase, and to make sure that that information is produced effectively and handed back at the end to meet those requirements. But regardless of whether if you're looking at the operational or delivery start, if any of the assets that you're working with are deemed to be sensitive, then part 5 should also be your go-to standard. Within that, there's a triage process which helps organizations and projects to determine which assets are deemed to be sensitive, and therefore to work out what additional measures may need to be put into place to ensure the security of the information about those specific assets. So yeah, that's probably where people should go to, depending on the particular scenario that they're facing.
I almost need to take that out as a short. I think that was probably the most informative statement that anyone could ever make about the use of the standards, and specifically around the challenges that I know we face here in Australia. And it's probably based upon the fact that most asset owners don't really know what information they need. And the answer being, well, part 3 is the process of maintaining your asset. So if you walk yourself through the steps of maintaining your asset in that operational phase through that standard, then you'll start to identify and be able to then pick out the pieces of information you need to respond to those challenges that you have, rather than being asked the question as part of the part 2 series and kind of shrugging your shoulders and going, oh, I don't really know. I don't know what I need. So refer to part 3 to gain the answers to then write part 2 requirements. Perfect. I think my world's been solved now, Paul. Now, the problem is here in Australia, it could come down to the maturity of the authors of the document, and that's possibly where I think it comes down to. But there are a significant number of projects, and these are even large-scale projects, where tender documentation include these broad brush statements saying this appointment shall be delivered in accordance with ISO 19650. And in most circumstances, the challenging part is that the tender documentation doesn't actually include any information requirements from the appointing party. Now, for those that aren't aware of the standard or haven't read it before, the appointing party is typically the client. In most circumstances, it's the asset owner or a representative of the asset owner. Sometimes it can be further down the line, but that's the most circumstances that is the case. For our asset owners, apart from that sage-like advice you just gave in your last statement, what would be the fundamental activities that you'd recommend that be undertaken by an appointing party before they even think about going out to tender? And this is going out to tender to the consultants at the start of the project, not out to tender to construction. So right at the start, what would be your Reader's Digest version of that?
So I mean, there's within both parts 2 and 3, there's the step 1 of the process, the assessment and need step. There's quite a few activities that need to be undertaken, as you say, before they even think about going out to tender. And I think the important thing to note there is that we recognise that not every asset owning organisation or client or appointing party, which is now the term, are going to have the capability or capacity to undertake all of those different activities. So it's made very clear in the standard that whilst they remain responsible for undertaking those activities, they can actually either employ a third party to come in and support them to undertake those activities, or they can discharge those responsibilities to one of the appointed parties to undertake on their behalf. So there's no real, or there shouldn't be any real excuse from the clients for not being able to undertake these activities. And without going through each one of them, I think probably some of the key ones is obviously around understanding their requirements for information. And at this stage, what they're looking at that at a project level. So the vast majority of projects are delivered using some form of gate management process, whatever that might be. And the way that works is that they, at each gate, the project decides whether to proceed to the next stage, and that's the ultimate decision. But to make that decision, they need a lot of questions need to be answered in order to make an informed decision about whether to proceed to the next stage. And so those questions that need to be answered, they're the basis for which they should be defining their project information requirements. Okay. And so they're the ones, so what they're actually going out for to procure is answers. They're going out to procure answers about for these questions so that they can make a decision to proceed. So things like, how much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take to build? Does it meet the brief? Does it meet the performance specification of the asset? Is it going to meet the business need? So there's all these sort of high level questions, and you get more granular as you go along. And so what they're going out is to procure answers to those. In addition to that, they have a responsibility, almost an obligation, to provide the right sort of collaborative and commercial environment for teams to work together in order to produce that information and provide them with those answers. So there's a number of activities within there, and that's looking around mainly the information standards that they need that information to be produced so that they can use and reuse that information during and beyond the project. Any specific production methods and procedures that they want teams to use or to adopt. Again, it depends on the maturity of the organization, but if there are any specific ones, then they need to get those documented as well. From a collaborative point of view, the responsibility, and this is quite contentious, but the responsibility for the provision of a centralized and shared repository for all this information, which we know and love as a common data environment, sits with the appointing party or the client. And again, they can either provide that themselves or employ a third party to provide it on their behalf. But ultimately, the provision of that environment, the common data environment of the CDE, sits with the client. And then start to look from the commercial side of things as well in terms of what we call the information protocol. And that really sets up the obligations for all parties, including the client, around the production, distribution and use of information that is generated as part of that delivery phase. So for me, they're probably some of the key fundamental activities that need to be completed before moving forward to the next step, which is obviously preparing the invitation to tender. And I think the pitfall that a lot of projects fall into is that they sort of, they want to, the point at which they start thinking about all this is the point at which they start to put the tender together, at which point, the pressure is on to get the invitations tenders out. And so therefore, they haven't got the capacity or the time that they need to give to these activities to prepare for that invitation to tender. And it's a sort of, again, quite common in terms of projects where they say, well, we'll just get the first appointment out and we'll do this for the next one. And then, well, maybe not this one, then maybe the one after. But the reality is every time they go out for an appointment and information is generated without all those activities completed, they're just introducing more and more risk into the project, because quite often that information that's being produced in those early appointments is then being used by the subsequent appointments in terms of coordination and use for decisions. So it's quite the risk increases every time you go out for an appointment that don't include all of those requirements, particularly the requirements for information.
You might find yourself not getting what you need if you don't ask for it correctly.
Yeah, or not asking for anything at all.
So there's an extensive amount of work that clients need to go to, or appointing parties need to go to before they even consider going into tender if they want to adopt the processes of ISO 19650. This is a really long process, but from my perspective, I look at the ISO 19650.2 process, the delivery of assets, as just another project management process. Now, what's covered in ISO 19650.2, and I guess that's the one we're focusing on today because it's one of we need this as the first starting point of processes that get delivered. So the process within that standard covers over 8 separate steps and over 40 different activities that are covered over those 8 steps. Now, you and I both know that we can talk for hours and hours and hours if we went into the specific details of each of the activities, which I think we don't have the time for today. And secondly, some people may fall asleep if we tried to do that individually. Could you just give us a brief overview of those steps and the purpose of each of the steps?
So, yeah, I guess this is going to be quite difficult without the use of any visual aids. But yeah, I'll certainly give it a go. I think the thing with the information management process is you're absolutely right. It's like any other process. It contains a series of interrelated activities that convert inputs to outputs to achieve a intended result. And for the information management process, that intended result is that the right people get the right information at the right time. Okay. And as you say, there are 8 steps within that process. Each of them needs to be completed before you move on to the next step. So if you visualize 8 different steps, steps 1 and 8, so the start and the end of the process, they may only need to be undertaken once for that particular project. whereas steps 2 to 7 will need to be undertaken for each and every appointment on that project. Okay, so we need to draw a distinction between the project and the appointments on it, and making, bearing in mind that appointments, and we use the term appointments rather than contracts, is because they can also be internal and external, or a combination of both. So if it's external, obviously through the use of a contract. If it's internal, potentially through the use of a work instruction or some other mechanism. But the process and the activities are exactly the same. And in terms of those 6 steps that need to be undertaken for each appointment, they're broken down into 3 phases. Okay, so steps 2 and 3 form the procurement phase. Steps 4 and 5 form the planning phase, and steps 6 and 7 form the production phase of that particular appointment. Okay, so we've, again, trying to just break that process down into a logical sort of sequence in terms of the procurement, planning, and production. Within each step, as you said, there are a number of activities distributed amongst them. So within part 2, there are 40. In part 3, there's a few more, but generally the activities are either the responsibility of either the appointing party, so the client, or the appointing parties, which are the suppliers and their supply chains. So within the standard, you'll notice each clause relates to each an activity, and it'll be written in the form of the appointing party shall, or the lead appointed party shall, and so on. But in general, the appointing party undertakes all the activities within steps 1 and 2. The lead appointed parties undertake the vast majority of activities within steps 3, 4, and 5. Although some of those activities are shared with the appointing parties or assigned to the client. As the producers of information, so the appointed party, so the supply chain, undertake the activities within step 6. And then to finish off, it's for the client or the appointing party to complete the process by undertaking the activities within steps 7 and 8. All right, so I'll be testing you on that later, Nathan. If that's all right. Well, hopefully that made sense.
Now, for people that can't see anything because this is a podcast, you should see Paul's facial expressions as he was going through the explanation of that. It was just priceless. Now, I feel privileged.
I was just making sure I got it right.
I did hear appointing party instead of appointed party in one instance, but I'll forgive you for that. I recorded a presentation the other day where I actually said the description of integrated digital delivery as integrated digital design, and I've just thought, you got to make mistakes like that occasionally. But Paul, from my perspective, there's not a lot of training options available in the market for people to actually learn about ISO 19650. And even today, before we began this chat, I was on having a conversation with people about the uptake of ISO 19650 in Australia, specifically around certification and the like, and how far away this market is here in Australia about that. And I think it's purely because there's not a lot of people out there providing knowledge and training. Over the last year or two, I'd been contemplating putting together my own training platform and training series for the market here in Australia. But, I was introduced to you, and your program with Operam Academy, and I was able to sit down through the pandemic here in Australia and actually complete your online program. And immediately undertaking that, I've just gone to myself, there's no point in reinventing the wheel here. I've got to partner with you and become an affiliate and help promote it here in Australia rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, because it's just, there's some to try and replicate the quality of what you produced it's a lot of thousands of hours of work. Paul, just so for the listeners understand, because there's not a lot of training options out there. Can you explain to the listeners specifically the courses that you have as an offering and how it's structured so that, they now have somewhere that they can go and learn about ISO 19650?
So early on, in terms of Operam, we did a lot of instructor-led learning because obviously when you're looking to adopt the process. The process is done or implemented by people. And if you look at the 40 activities within the process, it needs a wide variety of knowledge, experience, and authority. And it's unlikely that you're going to find some sort of superhero. Even you, Nathan, couldn't really undertake all these 40 activities. And so the reality is that each of the activities are going to be undertaken by a variety of different people, and maybe some people that you don't actually expect, and particularly the upstream activities when you're talking about the requirements owners, when you're talking about procurement, legal, commercial people who have to put all those tenders together and the appointments together, and so what we need to do as an industry is to educate the existing professionals from across all the different management functions that you find within an organisation. So that includes, things like the project management, asset management, design management, construction management, commercial management. All of these different functions need to understand, not only what the process is, but what their role is within that process. What are the activities that become before their bit? What activities come after their bit? And so what we started to do was to look at, what's the best way that we can support the individuals within the organizations? And so we came up with a curriculum that was very much based around the key activities within the process, rather than just doing a page turn of the standards, which, I accept not everybody's as enthusiastic as standards as I am. So it was very much more around activity based in terms of what do I need to do to fulfill my part of this process. And so to start, we developed that curriculum, and we started really at the beginning, and the very first course in the curriculum is called BIM, What's It All About? And we put this course together to try and not only sort of talk about the different perspectives of BIM and this term BIM that's invaded our sort of our terminology and industry, but also to address some of the preconceptions that people have around the term. And so from there, and using that as a foundation, we introduced an overview around the process, and then took a deeper dive into some of the key activities within it. And, it's been probably, a lot more successful than even I anticipated. As you say, we invested a lot of time and effort in developing this curriculum. And as I say, we've sold into over 40 countries. And our materials educated over, I think we're on to 12,000 professionals now. And, the feedback that we get is quite overwhelming at times. But, what we want to do is to continue that support in terms of developing more and more content around some of the newer standards within the series, but also maybe looking at some of the regional implementations. So working with experts like yourselves in other regions to develop some more regional based content. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about the future around Operam Academy particularly.
No, I think it's definitely well worth it, and I'm very happy to be part of that. One of 12,000. I see it feels so insignificant now. But Paul, thank you so much for your time today. And I have one final question, one that I asked all of my guests, and this series has actually been really exciting. I think I've found the answers from my guests to be very, very exciting. So I'm actually really looking forward to your response to this. What does BIM mean to you?
Oh, really? Oh, well, I don't think my response is probably going to be as exciting, if I'm being honest. So I guess the short version is the BIM for me is the collaborative production of information. Okay. And what I mean by that is going back to BS 1192, which defined the process for individuals and teams to work collaboratively to produce information, to coordinate information. For me, that is building information modeling. And the process is defined, the information management process defined in parts 2 and 3, set out the manager of information to enable the collaborative production of information, aka BIM. All right, I'll give you a little bit of a backstory to this as well. So when the first initial drafts of PAS 1192 Part 2, it didn't contain the word BIM once, okay? And the client at the time was the UK government, who had just gone out and banged this big BIM drum and BIM level 2, and the framework document didn't have the word BIM in it. So the compromise was that the title of PAS 1192 Part 2 was around the management of information when using BIM. Okay, so if you want to use BIM, this is how you manage information. And that has continued into the ISO, thankfully. So we've got the title around there about the management of information during the delivery phase when using BIM, and the operational phase when using BIM. And so, when you're talking about individuals and teams working together, again, enabled by a lot of the amazing technology and innovation that we're seeing within the industry, but it's very much about people and people working together collaboratively to produce that information. So for me, that is what BIM means to me.
Isn't it sad that politicians control the way that we work? I actually prefer the old naming. It would have been lovely to have seen the original naming, stick, and we would lose, this whole model-based concept, and it would have just been about, well, what information do we need? But full of wisdom as usual, Paul. But thanks very much for your time, mate.
Nathan, my pleasure.
Now, for more information on Paul and ISO 19650, please head over to the podcast section of the Skewed website for further reading. And if you're interested in training, you can jump onto the training part of my website as well. But I look forward to sharing our next podcast in a fortnight's time. Until then, good luck with your digital transition. Digital transition.